Texas, 1944. When the cattle cars rolled into the makeshift prisoner-of-war camp outside San Antonio, Lajos Farkas pressed his face against the narrow window and saw something unexpected. Cowboys. Real American cowboys with wide-brimmed hats and leather chaps, leaning against wooden fence posts like they'd stepped out of the picture shows he'd watched in Budapest before the war. At 35 years old and weighing nearly 300 pounds, Lajos had spent most of his adult life as the neighborhood baker, who everyone loved for his bread but whispered about behind his back. Now, stepping off that train with shackled hands and a number pinned to his torn uniform, he braced himself for the worst kind of humiliation an overweight man could face in enemy territory. Before we continue, subscribe and hit the bell. Here, we retell the human stories forgotten by war. The sun beat down mercilessly on the Texas plains as the Hungarian prisoners were marched through the camp gates. Lajos moved slowly, his heavy frame struggling with each step in the oppressive heat. Around him, fellow prisoners muttered prayers in Hungarian, their eyes darting between the armed guards and the curious cowboys who had gathered to watch the new arrivals. The camp itself looked nothing like the hellish prisons Lajos had imagined during the long journey across the Atlantic. Instead of towering concrete walls, there were simple wooden barracks surrounded by basic wire fencing. The smell of mesquite and barbecue smoke drifted through the air, mixing strangely with the scent of fear and sweat from the new prisoners. As they were processed and assigned to barracks, Lajos caught fragments of conversation between the American guards. He'd picked up enough English during his years as a baker. Tourists and businessmen often visited his shop in Budapest to understand that they were discussing work assignments. "The big Hungarian," he heard one guard say, pointing in his direction. "Think he can handle kitchen duty?" Another voice responded with a chuckle. "Look at the size of him. Bet he knows his way around food." Lajos felt his cheeks burn with familiar shame. The same feeling he'd carried since childhood, when other children would point and giggle at the fat baker's son. But something in the guard's tone was different. There was no malice, no cruel laughter, just matter-of-fact observation, the way one might comment on a tall man being good for reaching high shelves. For the first time since his capture at the Battle of the Drava River, Lajos allowed himself to hope that perhaps this American captivity might be different from the stories he'd heard about Russian prison camps, where men disappeared into the frozen wasteland, never to return. That evening, as the prisoners settled into their new quarters, Lajos lay on his narrow cot, listening to the strange sounds of the American Southwest. Instead of air raid sirens and artillery fire, he heard cattle lowing in the distance, the lonesome call of a train whistle, and something he hadn't expected: laughter. American laughter, drifting from the guard quarters where men were playing cards and sharing stories. It wasn't the harsh, mocking laughter he'd grown to fear, but the warm, genuine sound of men enjoying each other's company. As sleep finally took him, Lajos wondered if perhaps for the first time in his adult life he might find a place where his size didn't define him as a target for ridicule. The morning sun was already climbing high when Lajos reported to the camp kitchen for his first day of work. The mess hall was a sprawling wooden building with industrial-sized stoves and preparation tables that reminded him of his bakery back home, only much larger. As he stood in the doorway, uncertain and sweating in the Texas heat, a weathered cowboy in his 50s approached him. The man wore the distinctive wide-brimmed hat and leather vest that Lajos had seen the day before, but up close he could see the kindness in the American's weathered face. "You must be the Hungarian baker," the cowboy said in slow, clear English, extending a calloused hand. "Name's Chuck Rodriguez. I run the kitchen operations here, and I hear you know your way around dough and ovens." Lajos nodded nervously, unsure how much English he should reveal. "Lajos," he said simply, pointing to himself. Chuck smiled and repeated the name, though his pronunciation was charmingly mangled by his Texas drawl. "Lajos, that's a mouthful for us cowboys. How about we call you Big Lou? That worked for you, partner. Now tell us in the comments where you're watching from and what time of day this story found you. It's curious to know how far these human memories travel. The nickname hit Lajos like a physical blow, and he instinctively tensed, waiting for the laughter that always followed such observations about his size. But Chuck's expression remained friendly and respectful. Big Lou wasn't said with the sneer that Fat Lajos had been back home. It was spoken with the same casual respect that Cowboys gave to Tall Tom or Red Johnson, a simple descriptor that acknowledged who he was without judgment. For a moment, Lajos couldn't speak. In all his 35 years, no one had ever given him a nickname that felt like acceptance rather than mockery. Big Lou, he repeated slowly, testing how the American words felt in his mouth. Chuck grinned and slapped him gently on the shoulder. That's right, partner. Now let me show you what we're working with here. The kitchen was better equipped than many restaurants Lajos had seen in peacetime Budapest. There were massive ovens, industrial mixers and, most surprisingly, plenty of ingredients. Real flour, not the sawdust mixed substitutes they'd been using in Hungary during the war years. Fresh eggs, milk that hadn't been watered down, and spices he hadn't seen since 1941. As Chuck explained the daily routine, other kitchen workers began to arrive. Some were American soldiers assigned to mess duty, others were prisoners from various countries. What struck Lajos immediately was how easily they all seemed to work together. Language barriers existed, but they were overcome with gestures, shared smiles, and a universal understanding that good food required cooperation. When Chuck introduced him as Big Lou, our new baker from Hungary, the responses were uniformly welcoming. No one stared at his size or made whispered comments. They simply nodded and went about their work, accepting him as another pair of capable hands. By the end of his first day, Lajos had prepared enough bread for 800 men and had earned his first compliment in English from an American soldier. "Damn, Big Lou, this is better than what my mama used to make." As he walked back to the barracks that evening, still processing the strangeness of being called by a nickname that felt like belonging rather than othering, Lajos realized that something fundamental had shifted. For the first time since childhood, his size had been acknowledged without shame, and somehow, in this prison camp in the middle of nowhere, Texas, he was beginning to remember what it felt like to hold his head high. 3 weeks into his routine at the camp kitchen, Lajos had settled into a rhythm that felt almost normal. The work was hard, but familiar, and the other kitchen staff had accepted him not as a curiosity or a burden, but as Big Lou the baker, whose skills were genuinely valued. The bread he produced had become something of a camp legend, with prisoners and guards alike looking forward to the Hungarians' morning loaves that somehow managed to taste like home, regardless of which country that home happened to be. It was on a particularly scorching Tuesday afternoon, when the Texas heat had turned the kitchen into a furnace, that Chuck Rodriguez noticed Lajos struggling more than usual. The big Hungarian was sweating profusely as he worked the massive batches of dough for the evening meal, and his movements had become slower and more labored. Chuck had seen men succumb to heat exhaustion before, and he recognized the warning signs. What he did next would remain etched in Lajos's memory for the rest of his life. "Big Lou," Chuck called out, wiping his own sweat with a kitchen towel. "Take a break, partner. Come on outside for a minute." Lajos looked up from his work, confused. Breaks weren't scheduled for another hour, and he was a prisoner, not a regular employee. Surely this was some kind of test or trap. But Chuck was already heading toward the kitchen's back door, gesturing for him to follow. Reluctantly, Lajos set down his rolling pin and walked outside, expecting to find himself in trouble for some unknown infraction. What he found instead was Chuck standing beside a red Coca-Cola cooler, the kind with the distinctive white lettering that Lajos had only seen in American magazines before the war. The cowboy was fishing around in the ice-cold water inside the cooler, and when he straightened up, He was holding 2 glass bottles of Coca-Cola, their sides dripping with condensation in the desert heat. "Figured you could use something cold," Chuck said simply, handing one of the bottles to the stunned Hungarian. "This heat's enough to kill a horse, and you've been working harder than most men half your size." Lajos stared at the bottle in his hand as if it were made of gold. Coca-Cola was the stuff of dreams, an American luxury that had been completely unavailable in wartime Hungary. He'd heard stories about the mysterious sweet drink that Americans supposedly consumed like water, but he'd never imagined he'd actually taste it. More importantly, he'd never imagined that an American cowboy would share one with a fat Hungarian prisoner of war, simply because he looked hot and tired. The gesture was so unexpected, so genuinely kind, that Lajos felt tears threatening to spill down his cheeks. Chuck had already opened his bottle and taken a long drink, letting out a satisfied "Ah!" that made Lajos smile, despite his confusion. The cowboy noticed his hesitation and gestured toward the bottle cap. "Go ahead, partner. It ain't poisoned. Just the real thing, straight from Atlanta, Georgia." With trembling hands, Lajos opened his bottle and took his first sip of Coca-Cola. The taste was unlike anything he'd ever experienced. Sweet, fizzy, with flavors he couldn't identify, but that somehow tasted exactly like he'd imagined America might taste if America were a drink. As they stood there in the shade of the kitchen building, sipping their Coca-Colas in comfortable silence, Lajos felt something shift inside his chest. This wasn't charity or pity. This was simply one working man offering another working man relief from the heat. Chuck didn't see a fat prisoner or an enemy of America. He saw Big Lou, the baker who worked hard and deserved a cold drink on a hot day. For the first time since his capture, Lajos felt not just accepted, but genuinely cared for. When they finished their drinks and headed back inside, Chuck paused at the door. "Same time tomorrow if this heat keeps up," he said with a grin. "Can't have my best baker melting away on me." As Lajos returned to his dough, he carried with him the revolutionary knowledge that kindness could exist even between enemies, and that sometimes the simplest gestures could restore a man's faith in humanity. Sunday mornings at Camp Hearn had taken on a rhythm that felt almost civilian. Unlike other prisoner-of-war facilities, where weekends meant extended work details or punishment drills, this converted Texas ranch allowed for rest, reflection, and something approaching normalcy. The American Guard seemed to understand that even prisoners needed time to remember they were human beings with souls worth preserving. For Lajos, Sundays had become his favorite day of the week, not because the work lessened. He still baked fresh bread for the morning meal, but because the pace slowed enough for genuine conversations and unexpected friendships. The kitchen became a gathering place where Hungarian prisoners and American personnel would share coffee and stories, creating bonds that transcended the artificial boundaries of war. On this particular Sunday in late September, the Texas air carried the first hints of autumn's approach. The brutal summer heat was finally beginning to break, replaced by mornings that were almost cool, and evenings that invited lingering conversations under the vast star-filled sky. Lajos was finishing his morning baking, humming a Hungarian folk song his grandmother had taught him, when Tom Brennan appeared in the kitchen doorway. The rancher had become more than a regular visitor to the camp. He had become something Lajos had never expected to find in America, a genuine friend. Tom's visits were officially to consult on supply deliveries and ranch management, but increasingly it seemed he came simply to check on Big Lou and sample whatever new recipes the Hungarian baker was experimenting with. Their conversations had evolved from polite exchanges to the comfortable banter of men who genuinely enjoyed each other's company. "Morning, Lou," Tom called out, hanging his own cowboy hat on a kitchen peg with the familiarity of an old friend. The gesture spoke of countless previous visits, of a relationship that had grown naturally from mutual respect to deep affection. "Smells like heaven in here as usual." "What miracle are you working on today?" Lajos looked up from the dough he was kneading, his face breaking into the genuine smile that had replaced his previous expression of cautious anxiety. The transformation was remarkable. Where once there had been hunched shoulders and downcast eyes, now there was confidence and warmth. The cowboy hat that Tom had given him weeks earlier sat comfortably on his head, now as much a part of his identity as his baker's apron. "Good morning, Mr. Tom," Lajos replied, his English continuing to improve through daily practice with American friends who corrected him gently and praised his progress. "I make Hungarian sweet bread today. My grandmother's recipe, kalaks we call it, is special bread for celebrations." Tom's weathered face lit with the interest of a man who appreciated craftsmanship in all its forms. "Your grandmother's recipe? Must be something special then. She teach you everything you know about baking?" As Lajos worked, his large hands moving with surprising delicacy through the enriched dough, he found himself telling Tom about his grandmother, Anna Farkas, who had been the true heart of his family's baking tradition. It was the first time in years that he'd spoken about his family without feeling the crushing weight of loss and separation. The first time these memories brought warmth instead of pain. "She was small woman, very strong," Lajos explained, braiding the sweet bread with practiced movements that seemed almost like a dance. "Maybe 4 feet and 10 inches, but she command kitchen like General command army. She say good bread need 3 things: good ingredients, good hands, and good heart. The heart, she say, is most important. Without heart, bread is just food. With heart, bread is love you can taste." Tom nodded thoughtfully, watching the transformation of simple ingredients into something beautiful and nourishing. "Sounds like a wise woman. My own grandmother used to say something similar about raising cattle, said you could have the best land and the finest stock, but if you didn't care about them, really care about their welfare and happiness, you'd never succeed. Animals can sense whether you see them as just business or as living creatures deserving respect." The conversation drifted naturally to family stories, childhood memories, and the wisdom passed down from generation to generation. Lajos found himself sharing details about his life in Budapest that he'd kept locked away during his years of imprisonment. His courtship of Maria, their small but thriving bakery, the regular customers who had become like family, the satisfaction of creating something that brought joy to his community. "Maria, she learned to help in bakery," Lajos continued, his voice softening with love and longing. "At first, she burn everything, make terrible mess, but she have good heart for learning, and soon she make better strudel than my own mother. Customers, they come not just for my bread, but for Maria's smile and her way of remembering everyone's favorite." Tom listened with the patience of a man who understood that these stories were precious gifts, memories that had sustained a prisoner through dark times and were now being shared with someone trusted enough to receive them. The rancher had his own stories to share, about his late brother, about the challenges of ranch life, about his wife Martha's struggles with their children grown and scattered by war. It was then that Tom made a suggestion that would create one of Lajos's most cherished memories of his time in Texas. "Lou," Tom said, his tone becoming more serious, "I was wondering, would you be interested in coming out to my ranch today? Just for a few hours as my guest. I've been telling my wife Martha about your baking and your stories, and she's been pestering me for weeks to bring you over for Sunday dinner. She's a fine cook herself, won prize for her apple pie 3 years running at the county fair, and I think you two would enjoy meeting each other." Lajos stopped kneading, his hands frozen in the dough as his mind struggled to process what he'd just heard. Leave the camp? Have dinner with an American family as a guest rather than a prisoner? The idea was so far beyond anything he'd imagined possible that he couldn't immediately find words to respond. "Is this permitted?" he asked carefully, his voice barely above a whisper. Throughout his imprisonment, he'd learned to be cautious about anything that seemed too good to be true, too kind to be real. Tom's face broke into a wide grin, the kind that reached his eyes and spoke of genuine pleasure in bringing happiness to others. Already cleared it with Captain Mitchell yesterday. Spent a good hour convincing him, but he agrees you've been a model prisoner and that the camp policy allows for supervised visits to local establishments under the right circumstances. I'll be your escort and take full responsibility. I promise to have you back by evening roll call. The next hour passed in a blur of preparation and barely contained excitement. Lajos carefully finished his sweetbread, ensuring that the kitchen would be ready for the evening meal preparation. He washed thoroughly, changed into his best clothes, a clean white shirt that the American Red Cross had provided, dark trousers that had been mended with care, and shoes that he'd polished until they gleamed. His baker's apron was folded carefully in a paper bag, along with ingredients for a special bread he wanted to make for his hosts, a gesture of gratitude that felt inadequate for the magnitude of their invitation. Captain Mitchell stopped by personally to review the arrangement, his military bearing softened by genuine affection for the Hungarian baker who had become one of the camp's most valued residents. "Lou, you understand this is a privilege, not a right," the captain said formally, though his tone was warm. "Mr. Brennan has vouched for you completely, and I trust both his judgment and your character. Enjoy yourself, but remember you're representing not just yourself, but all the prisoners here." "Yes, sir," Lajos replied, standing straighter in his cowboy hat and clean clothes. "I understand. I will make you proud." Within another hour, Lajos found himself sitting in Tom Brennan's pickup truck, driving through the Texas countryside toward a ranch that seemed to stretch endlessly under the vast blue sky. The landscape was unlike anything he'd experienced in Hungary, no rolling hills or dense forests, but an endless expanse of grassland, dotted with cattle and broken by occasional groves of mesquite trees. The sky seemed impossibly large, stretching from horizon to horizon without obstruction. "Never seen country like this," Lajos murmured, his face pressed to the passenger window like a child seeing the ocean for the first time. "Takes some getting used to," Tom agreed. "When I was young, all this emptiness used to make me feel lonesome. Now I can't imagine living anywhere else. There's something about all this space that makes a man feel free, like there's room for all his dreams, and then some." The Brennan Ranch was everything Lajos had imagined when he'd first heard Cowboys described in the camp's recreation hall. A sprawling homestead, with a white farmhouse surrounded by corrals, barns and pastures, where cattle grazed peacefully under the afternoon sun. The house itself was larger than Lajos's entire Budapest apartment building, yet it somehow managed to look welcoming, rather than intimidating, with a wide front porch furnished with rocking chairs and flower boxes that spoke of a woman's touch. As they pulled up to the house, a woman emerged from the front door, wiping her hands on a kitchen towel that had seen years of faithful service. Even from a distance, Lajos could see that she moved, with the efficient grace of someone accustomed to managing a household and caring for others. Martha Brennan was a woman in her 50s with graying brown hair, pinned back practically but attractively, and the kind of face that suggested a lifetime of smiling, of finding joy in simple pleasures and extending warmth to everyone she met. Her clothes were simple but well made, a blue cotton dress with a crisp white apron, comfortable shoes that had walked many miles in service of her family. When Tom introduced Lajos as Big Lou, the baker I've been telling you about, she stepped forward without hesitation and extended her hand with the natural warmth that seemed to define the best of American hospitality. "Lou, I'm so pleased to finally meet you. Tom hasn't stopped talking about your bread for weeks. I was beginning to think he'd forgotten I could cook at all." Her laugh was genuine and infectious, immediately putting Lajos at ease despite his nervousness about being a guest in an American home. Her easy manner and genuine warmth dissolved the anxiety that had been building in Lajos's chest during the drive. This wasn't charity or condescension. This was genuine welcome, the kind he'd experienced in his own home when entertaining friends in happier times. As she led them into her kitchen, Lajos was struck by how much it reminded him of his grandmother's workspace in Budapest. Practical but welcoming, filled with the tools and ingredients of someone who took cooking seriously as both craft and expression of love. Copper pots hung from hooks on the wall, mason jars filled with preserved fruits lined open shelves, and the wooden countertops bore the honest scars of decades of meal preparation. "I brought supplies to make bread for you," Lajos said shyly, holding up his paper bag with the reverence of someone offering a treasured gift. "Hungarian sweetbread, kalaks, like my grandmother make for special occasions. I hope you will like." Martha's face lit up with the delight of someone who understood that food was more than sustenance. It was culture, memory, and love made tangible. "How wonderful! I'd love to watch you work. I've been baking for 30 years, but I'm always eager to learn new techniques, especially from someone with your reputation." As Lajos began preparing his grandmother's recipe, Martha proved to be an enthusiastic and insightful student. She asked thoughtful questions about Hungarian baking traditions, the differences between European and American flour, the cultural significance of different breads in Hungarian celebrations. Her curiosity was genuine, not the polite interest of someone making conversation, but the deep engagement of a fellow craftsperson eager to learn. "In Budapest," Lajos explained as he worked the enriched dough, "kalaks is bread for happiness. We make for weddings, for births, for festivals. Shape is important, braided like rope, because life is many threads woven together, strong because each strand make others stronger." Martha watched his technique with the focused attention of a student, occasionally asking him to repeat a motion or explain the reasoning behind a particular step. Her questions revealed her own deep understanding of baking science and her appreciation for the cultural traditions that elevated cooking from mere necessity to art. While the bread was rising in Martha's warm kitchen, she gave him a tour of her home that felt like a journey through American family life. The house was filled with family photographs that told the story of lives well lived. Wedding pictures, baby portraits that had grown into graduation photos, snapshots of family gatherings around holiday tables, handmade quilts draped over furniture spoke of winter evenings spent in creative work, while bookshelves lined with well-worn volumes suggested a family that valued learning and reflection. She showed him pictures of her children with the mixture of pride and worry that seemed universal among parents during wartime. Her two sons were serving overseas, David with the Army in Europe, Michael with the Navy in the Pacific. Her daughter Sarah was married and living in California, working in a defense plant while her husband served in the Marines. "It must be so hard," she said quietly, pausing at a photograph of her youngest son in his Army uniform, "being so far from your own family, not knowing when you'll see them again." Lajos nodded, touched by her genuine sympathy and the way she spoke to him not as a prisoner or an enemy, but as a fellow human being facing the universal challenges of separation and uncertainty. "I have wife in Budapest, Maria," he said, his voice soft with longing. "She not know if I am alive. Every day I wonder if she is safe, if she have enough food, if she remember my face." Martha placed a gentle hand on his arm, her touch conveying more comfort than a dozen speeches about hope and faith. "After the war, you'll see her again. I truly believe that. Good people find their way back to each other." When Tom returned from checking on his cattle, he found Lajos and Martha deep in conversation about bread recipes, family traditions, and the ways that food carried culture across oceans and generations. The Hungarian baker was more animated than Tom had ever seen him, gesturing enthusiastically as he described the different types of bread served at Hungarian celebrations, the seasonal variations that marked the passage of the year, the regional differences that reflected local history and ingredients. "Martha's got him talking more than I've heard in weeks," Tom observed with satisfaction, settling into his own kitchen chair with the contentment of a man who had orchestrated something beautiful. "We've been having the most wonderful conversation," Martha replied, her eyes bright with the pleasure of new friendship. "Lou has been teaching me about Hungarian holiday traditions, and I've been sharing some of our Texas customs. Amazing how much we have in common, despite coming from such different places." Dinner was a revelation for Lajos that went far beyond the excellent food. The Brennan family table was set with their best china, delicate plates with tiny blue flowers that had been Martha's grandmother's, crystal glasses that caught the afternoon light, silver that gleamed with careful polishing. But more than the formal table setting, it was the way he was treated that took his breath away. He was seated not at the foot of the table, or in some position that marked him as a guest or outsider, but at Tom's right hand, in the place traditionally reserved for honored family friends. Martha served him first, not out of obligation, but with the natural grace of a hostess welcoming someone she genuinely cared about. The conversation included him seamlessly, seeking his opinions on everything from cattle ranching to the best methods for preserving fruit. Martha had prepared a feast that showcased the best of American home cooking, pot roast that had been slow-cooked until it fell apart at the touch of a fork, mashed potatoes enriched with butter and cream, green beans from her own garden, still crisp and bright, cornbread that was somehow both hearty and delicate. For dessert, there was apple pie made with fruit from their own orchard, the crust golden and flaky, the filling fragrant with cinnamon and vanilla. "This is best meal I have since leaving Budapest," Lajos said with complete honesty, savoring each bite not just for its flavor, but for the love and care that had gone into its preparation. As they ate, the conversation flowed easily between topics that revealed the universal concerns and dreams that connected people across national boundaries. Tom told stories about his brother, the original owner of the cowboy hat that Lajos now wore with such pride. Martha shared memories of her own grandmothers, both strong women who had homesteaded in Texas when it was still wild territory, facing dangers and hardships that had forged them into pillars of their communities. "You know, Lou," Tom said as they finished Martha's apple pie, his voice taking on the reflective tone of a man sharing something important, "you remind me a lot of my brother. He had the same way of putting his whole heart into everything he did, whether it was breaking horses, or helping a neighbor, or just sitting on the porch watching the sunset." It was then that Martha made a gesture that would stay with Lajos forever. She disappeared into her kitchen and returned with a small wrapped package, her expression shy but determined. "I hope you don't mind," she said somewhat hesitantly, "but I wanted to give you something to remember today by. I know it's not much, but I thought you might find it useful." Inside the package was a leather-bound notebook, hand-tooled with intricate designs that spoke of hours of careful work. His initials, LF, had been burned into the cover in elegant script, and the leather had been treated and polished until it glowed with rich warmth. The pages inside were blank, creamy paper that invited the touch of pen or pencil. "For your recipes," Martha explained, her voice soft with emotion, "so you can write down all your grandmother's secrets and maybe add some new ones you learn here in Texas. Every good cook needs a place to keep their treasures." Lajos held the notebook with trembling hands, overwhelmed by the thoughtfulness of the gift and what it represented. This wasn't charity or pity, this was recognition of his worth as a craftsman, acknowledgement of his knowledge as something valuable enough to preserve and pass on. I cannot accept," he stammered, though every fiber of his being wanted to clutch the notebook to his chest. "Of course you can," Martha said firmly. "It would make me happy to know you're using it. Besides, I'm hoping you'll fill it with recipes and then share some of them with me. I have a feeling I could learn a lot from you." As the sun began to set over the Texas landscape, casting long golden shadows across the ranch and painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, Tom prepared to drive Lajos back to the camp. The Hungarian baker found himself genuinely reluctant to leave this place where he had felt so completely welcomed and valued, where he had been treated not as a prisoner or an enemy, but as a friend worth cherishing. Standing on the front porch with the evening breeze carrying the scent of grass and wildflowers, Martha took both of his hands in hers and looked directly into his eyes. "Thank you for coming today, Lou," she said with quiet sincerity. "You've brought such joy to our home. I hope you know that you're welcome here any time, not as our prisoner or our project, but as our friend. You'll always have a place at our table." Martha's eyes filled with tears that she didn't try to hide. "You're such a good man, Lou. Your wife, Maria, is lucky to have you, and when this war is over and you go home to her, I hope you'll remember that you have friends here in Texas who care about you." As they drove back through the gathering darkness, the headlights of Tom's truck cutting through the Texas night, Tom was quiet, letting Lajos process the experience of the day. The silence between them was comfortable, the companionable quiet of friends who didn't need words to communicate their mutual affection and respect. Finally, as the lights of Camp Hearn appeared in the distance, Tom spoke. "Lou, I want you to know something, and I want you to really hear this. What happened today wasn't charity or pity or some kind of propaganda exercise. Martha and we genuinely enjoy your company. You're a good man with a kind heart and valuable skills, and good men are welcome in our home, regardless of what uniform they're wearing or what country they're from." Back at the camp, as Lajos prepared for bed in the barracks he shared with his fellow Hungarian prisoners, he opened Martha's notebook and wrote his first entry. Not a recipe, but a simple record of the day that had changed his understanding of what was possible between people who were supposed to be enemies. September 24th, 1944. Today I was guest in American home. Today I remember I am human being with worth and dignity, not just prisoner with number. Today I have hope again that world can be different, that peace can be built on friendship instead of fear. Martha and Tom Brennan show me that kindness is not weakness, that strength can be gentle, that enemies can become family if hearts are open. Istvan, his bunkmate, watched him write with curiosity and growing amazement. The change in Lajos over the past months had been remarkable, but tonight there was something different, something that seemed to glow from within. "How was it, this visit to the ranch?" Istvan asked quietly, not wanting to disturb other prisoners who were settling in for the night. Lajos looked up from his writing, still wearing his cowboy hat, even though he was in his sleeping clothes. The hat had become such a part of his identity that removing it felt like taking off a piece of his soul. "Istvan," he said softly, his voice filled with wonder and certainty, "I think we have been wrong about Americans. I think maybe they have been trying to show us something we were too frightened or too proud to see." "What's that?" "That being enemies in war does not mean we cannot be human beings to each other. That kindness is not about nationality or politics or who wins battles. That maybe, when this war ends, we can choose to remember the humanity we found, instead of just the hatred we were taught." As Lajos finally settled into sleep that night, his cowboy hat hanging on the bedpost beside him and Martha's notebook tucked safely under his pillow, he carried with him the warmth of genuine friendship and the revolutionary idea that perhaps, when the war finally ended, the world might be ready for a different kind of peace. One built on understanding rather than hatred, on individual character rather than national identity, on the simple recognition that good people existed everywhere, waiting to be discovered by those brave enough to look beyond the uniforms and see the hearts beneath. October arrived in Texas with cooler mornings and the first hints that summer's relentless heat was finally beginning to break. For Lajos, the changing season brought an unexpected opportunity that would prove more meaningful than any gift he'd yet received, the chance to write a letter home to his wife Maria in Budapest. The International Red Cross had established a limited mail service for prisoners of war, though letters were heavily censored and could take months to reach their destinations. When Captain Mitchell announced that prisoners could submit one letter each for potential delivery, Lajos felt his hands tremble as he accepted the single sheet of paper and regulation envelope. He'd been carrying the memory of Maria's face for over 3 years now, treasuring every detail, her dark eyes that crinkled when she smiled, her gentle hands that had learned to help him in the bakery, her voice humming Hungarian folk songs while she worked. The last time he'd seen her, she'd been standing in the doorway of their small apartment, watching him leave for what they both hoped would be a short military service. That evening, Lajos sat in the recreation hall with Martha Brennan's leather notebook open beside him, trying to find words that could cross an ocean of war and separation. Around him, other Hungarian prisoners struggled with their own letters, some writing frantically, others staring at blank pages with the paralysis of having too much to say. "My dearest Maria," he finally began, his handwriting careful and precise, despite his emotional state. "I am alive and well in America, my darling. I know you must have worried every day, and I'm sorry for the terrible silence. The Red Cross says this letter may reach you, so I write with hope in my heart. I am prisoner of war in Texas, a place of cowboys and endless sky. I know this sounds strange, but I must tell you something that would seem impossible if you had not known me all these years. I am happy here, not happy to be away from you, never that, but happy in a way I had forgotten was possible. The Americans here see me as you always saw me, as a man with dignity and worth. They call me Big Lou, and it is said with friendship, not mockery. I work in the kitchen, baking bread as Papa taught me. They say my bread is the best they have tasted. Maria, do you remember how in Budapest people would sometimes laugh when I walked by? How children would point? Here, children come to the camp with their fathers and they wave at me through the fence. They know me as the baker who makes good bread, not as the fat man who deserves ridicule." As he wrote, Tom Brennan entered the recreation hall and approached with his characteristic warm smile. "Writing to your wife?" Tom asked gently. Lajos nodded, suddenly self-conscious about his emotional letter. "Is difficult to explain. How different life is here." Tom pulled up a chair. "Mind if I add something to your letter? Just a short note to let her know you're being treated well?" The offer surprised and touched Lajos deeply. "You would do this?" "Of course. A woman deserves to know her husband is not just surviving, but thriving." Tom took a fresh sheet of paper and began writing. "Dear Mrs. Farkas, my name is Tom Brennan, and I am a rancher here in Texas. I wanted you to know that your husband has become not just respected here, but genuinely beloved. His skill as a baker has brought joy to many people, and his character has earned him friendships that will last long after this war ends. He speaks of you often, and with great love. Please know that he is healthy, safe, and treated with the dignity that any good man deserves. We will take care of him until he can return to you. With respect, Tom Brennan." As Tom wrote, other American personnel became aware of what was happening. Sam Rodriguez, the head cook, approached with his own addition. "Mrs. Farkas, your husband has taught me more about baking in 2 months than I learned in 10 years. But more than that, he has shown all of us what grace and kindness look like, even in difficult circumstances. You should be very proud of the man you married." Jake Morrison added his voice. "Ma'am, Big Lou is one of the finest men I've ever met. He works harder than anyone, never complains, and treats everyone with respect. My son looks up to him like family. Even Captain Mitchell contributed. Mrs. Farkas, your husband receives exemplary treatment and has earned the personal respect of our entire staff through his dignity and good character." By evening's end, Lajos's single-page letter had grown into a packet of testimonials from Americans who had been touched by his presence. As he prepared to seal the envelope, he added his final words. "Maria, I am sending you words from American friends. Yes, friends. When I return to you, and I will return, I will not be the same man who left with his head down. I will be the man you always saw in me, but also something more, a man who has learned that dignity comes from within. I wear a cowboy hat now, given by a kind rancher. I carry a notebook filled with recipes, given by his wife. I have learned that kindness exists in unexpected places, and that friendship can bloom between enemies. Wait for me, my darling. I'm coming home, bringing with me new understanding of what it means to be worthy of your love. Your devoted husband, Lajos P.S. They call me Big Lou here, and when I return, perhaps you will call me that too. It is a name spoken with love, and it has taught me to love myself again. The packet was sealed and handed to Captain Mitchell for delivery through Red Cross channels. As Lajos walked back to his barracks, he felt lighter than he had in years. Istvan was waiting, curious about the evening's events. They all wrote letters for you? Lajos nodded, settling onto his bunk. They wanted Maria to know that I am not just surviving here, I am flourishing. And are you? Flourishing? Lajos touched his cowboy hat, then opened Martha's notebook filled with recipes and memories. Istvan, when I arrived here, I expected to be broken further. Instead, I have been rebuilt into something I had forgotten I could be. Maria will receive this letter and understand. Her husband is coming home whole. If this story has moved you, please like and share it. Help Lajos's story reach more people and remind us all what war tried to erase, our capacity for unexpected friendship and redemption. Outside their window, the Texas night was vast and starlit. Somewhere under those same stars, Maria was waiting, not knowing that her husband was not only alive, but had rediscovered the joy and dignity she had always seen in him. Subscribe to the channel, hit that like button, and tell us in the comments which part of Big Lou's story touched you most. Because sometimes peace begins when we retell the past with empathy, and remember that humanity can flourish even in the darkest times.